Very nice. So hello, everyone, and welcome. For those of you I don't know, I'm Rabbi Zachary Goodman, one of the rabbis here at Holy Blossom. Just want to begin by saying a couple of thank yous, and I won't take up too much time. First, of course, to Professor Paul Liptz for being with us today from Israel, for your incredible talk, and we'll introduce you formally in just a moment. I also want to say thank you to Les Rothschild, who was instrumental in putting together this speaker series, serving as many hats at Holy Blossom Temple, but in this capacity as the co-chair of our Israel Engagement Committee. For those of you who are not able to join us 2 weeks ago, we were with the Weizmann Institute of Science with Professor Ozeri. We have a recording of that as well, and I'll circulate that around. I think I already did. But today we are with Professor Paul Liptz for a lecture, a conversation, an engagement entitled A Turbulent Period, Israeli Politics in the Middle East. Oops, what's happening here? I lost my piece. So we are so grateful to Professor Liptz. Just a very brief introduction, if this is your first time hearing from Paul, that Paul initially went to Israel as a volunteer just one day before the Six-Day War in 1967, and lectured at the Hebrew University before moving to Tel Aviv University, where he was on faculty for over 40 years. And at the same time, Paul was involved in the Reform movement and worked for NIFTY and for the Union, World Union for Progressive Judaism, lectured at HUC, the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem. And he says in his so-called retirement, to whatever that means, very active in these last few COVID months, the COVID-19 era, with Zoom presentations and speaking engagements around the world. So Professor Liptz, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you now and spotlight you for everyone. You should be able to share your screen as well. And the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us.
So I'm going to do a share screen. Just one thing more. Good. Okay. Hi. It's good to be with you. It's lovely to be with Holy Blossom again. This is not an unusual experience for me. I've been to your synagogue on a few occasions, and I know many people from Holy Blossom. So it's wonderful being with you again. The topic of a turbulent period is really, it's been a very unusual several months in Israel. I'm not going to go so much into the earlier events of May, the conflict with Hamas and those kind of issues. But what I'm going to try and do, I'll start off with some Middle Eastern issues. And what I often find, even with myself, living in Israel, I kind of, most of the time, feeling I'm living in Europe, particularly the part of Israel that I live in, north of Tel Aviv. But I think what we have to remember is that the area, the region that we're living in is such a complex region. It's a world of its own. And in trying to understand Israel, even for myself, I feel I have to go back again and again to looking at the Middle East. And I have to look at Israel in the context of the Middle East, because I think it makes it clearer what's happening here. So just some initial comments about the area. My apologies. Firstly, just very quickly to remind ourselves that we're really part of the wider world. The tremendous amount of interest that large countries have in Israel and the Middle East generally always puts us in a difficult position. Just to give you a case of the last 2-3 days, Israeli planes were attacking some sites in Syria. Russia, which is a patron of Syria, actually stopped the actions of the Israeli planes. So here we're in a situation, we get on quite well with Russia, but because Syria is a client state of Russia, things get very complex. And that's really pretty much how we spend our lives, having to deal with not only the local events, but much broader. What is the Middle East? And this isn't new for now, but it's a general picture. Tremendous tension between Middle Eastern countries. Just like we used to say about Europe 50 years ago or so, Europe isn't one Europe. So in the same ways, Middle East isn't one Middle East. The difference, I think, with Europe, which was only Europe, is that in our particular case, we have three non-Arab states, Iran, Turkey, and Israel. Of particular importance is the Sunni majority Shi'i minority, and I'll pick that up, or point that point up just in a moment. This is of profound interest to all of us, because when we use the term Islam in the wider world, we imagine we're talking about one large, very large religion. But when we get into the nitty-gritty of the Middle East, we actually recognize that we always have to be much more aware of the Sunni and the Shi'i. We won't go into the historical background, which goes back many hundreds of years, but those differences are significant. The other issue which we find, and Israel tries to help in this particular realm, are the ongoing economic challenges. Just to mention four of the many countries which find themselves in economic crisis: Egypt, as a result of its very large population; Iran, partly because of the sanctions, but also because of poor administration, and there's a lot of unrest among certain groups in Iran for that reason; Jordan, which is a very poor country, very minimal amount of natural resources, and if they don't get assistance from some of the richer countries, Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or something like that, then these kind of countries over here, life in Jordan is difficult. Lebanon is absolutely in a major, major crisis for many, many reasons. It's a complex, multi-ethnic country, and the political elite has been extremely corrupt. Then we have the refugees issues. We have the Palestinians, which clearly for Israel is a major issue. Vast numbers of Syrians, Africans, all coming in to the Middle East or trying to get out of the Middle East. And last but not least, we have ongoing civil wars. Just to take for a moment the Sunni Shi'i issue, I think this is an interesting map, because it shows that each of the countries, pretty much all the countries in the Middle East, and I'm dealing not with North Africa, but the Middle East proper, all the way over to Afghanistan, we see the Sunni Shi'i is a central event. By the way, this is extremely important for Israel, because at the moment, and it's been true in the past, at least since 1979, when Khomeini came into power in Iran, we've been allies of the Sunni. And therefore, we find ourselves having to act in a particular realm where we try to deal with our Sunni allies. We have very little contact, or very few contacts, with the various Shi'i groups. Let's just take yet another case study, and that is Turkey. Turkey has hot-cold policies in the area, and all these countries that are mentioned here somehow dealing with Turkey in one way or the other. And as you'll see a little later, we in Israel are experiencing kind of an attempt, apparently, by Turkey to improve its relations with Israel. Then we just take as another case study, just to speak about complexity, very, very hard situation to understand exactly what's going on in Saudi Arabia, particularly with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, who is an extremely important person. And there's a level of family insecurity in Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis don't normally like that term to be used. Where are we? Where is our particular component in this unusual part of the world? Firstly, we have to accept now, as in the past, much of what we are in the global realm is assisted by the United States. At all times that the United States is a friendly ally, a patron in many senses, things are good. It doesn't mean we don't have differences, but essentially that is the position regardless of whether there's a Republican president or a Democratic one. a Democrat one. Israel, in trying to improve itself in the Middle East, has a policy of assisting countries in distress. By the way, we know about certain case studies. Israel has a totally underworld environment as well, where many things are going on in the Middle East which are not known about, or just a little bit is known. So it really is quite a difficult issue for someone like myself, an historian, and sometimes knowing certain things, but not yet having the evidence to prove it. The strong army and the Mossad is important for us, once again, interacting with our allies. And what I think is particularly interesting in the modern period, and I'll go into this in greater detail, are the peace treaties which we've had. The 1979 peace treaty with Egypt was an extremely important event in Israeli reality, because Egypt until then was our major enemy. And this reality that we have, and it's an important case study where enemies can become allies, is important for Israeli society. 1994, the agreement with Jordan, ups and downs, but things are on the up at the moment. 2000, as part of the Abraham Accords with Bahrain and the UAE, and this year, Morocco normalization, and just a few days ago, direct flights between Israel and Morocco. We have different kind of levels of discussion with Oman, Sudan, and Saudi Arabia, a high level of cooperation with Egypt, particularly because of these Hamas and Sinai issue, and the recent phone call by President Erdogan of Turkey, who phoned our new President Herzog, to discuss improving situation. We never quite sure exactly where those are going to go. The recent event of improved relations between Israel and Jordan are coming about essentially because the former government under Prime Minister Netanyahu had very, very poor relations with King Abdullah II. This had been a problem over the last few years, but very recently, Prime Minister Bennett and Defense Minister Gantz met King Abdullah in Amman. And in addition to which, Foreign Minister Lapid, who I'll speak about in more detail later, met their foreign minister.
You didn't answer me, so I didn't know. Well, you don't answer.
If you could just mute yourselves, please. So the main discussion with Jordan is about water. Israel is doing well in its water supply. Not only did we have an excellent winter, but the water resources that we have at the moment have really enabled us to go to the Jordanian government and sell a significant amount of water to them, which is extremely important for Jordan. I want to speak a little bit about Hamas without going into the major issues of May this year, but something about Hamas, which I think the wider world isn't aware of, and I know that many countries, including Toronto, people in Toronto were demonstrating on the streets without perhaps understanding how we in Israel perceive Hamas. Hamas is a Sunni country, but it's close relationship with Shiite Iran. Therefore, that puts Hamas in a problematic relationship with many Sunni countries. And I'll speak about Eyal Ziss's comment just in a moment. The Hamas in Gaza survives essentially with Qatar's financial assistance. A lot of issues are going on, by the way, of how the money should be handed over to Hamas, whether the money is actually going to the population or whether it's going for military sources for the Hamas. So Israel finds itself in the situation of trying to work out with Qatar, who we don't have comfortable relations, exactly how the money is going to be used. What is very clear to most Middle Eastern countries is not our military strength, which is obviously one component, but rather that we're a startup nation. And this has been a major factor in the recent 6 months or so in really being able to move closer towards certain Arab countries than in the past. The technology of Israel, the medical resources we have here, desert control, all these kind of factors are of major interest to the Arab and other nations around us. And therefore, what we're essentially finding is we can get on sometimes without peace treaties. It isn't all about peace treaties. Peace treaties are very useful, but as much as anything else, it's about what we can give to the Middle East and what we can get from the Middle East. I'd like to quote for a moment Eyal Zisser, who's one of our top Middle Eastern experts, who wrote in an article in May the following, and I'd just like to read it because I think sometimes this particular issue that he brings up is not fully understood. The Arab world has come to understand what the wider world and maybe even Israel finds it difficult to internalize. Hamas has not and never will be interested in negotiations, agreements, or even long-term ceasefire accords. It certainly isn't interested in seeing a thriving Gaza that lives alongside Israel in peace. Every round of violence takes the Palestinians and their interests backward, while Israel continues to move forward. I'm not making this as a political statement, but Eyal, who I know well because we were together in the Middle East department at Tel Aviv University, Eyal is a highly respected person, and I think listening to his comment on this particular issue is interesting. And just to emphasize, the Arab world has come to understand what the wider world and maybe even Israel finds it difficult to internalize. I think this is sometimes useful. When we're in our position, we maybe look at issues differently from people in the outside world. Let's now move over to the Israeli political situation, March 2021. I've been interested in Israeli politics right from the very beginning, even before I made Aliyah in 1967. There is nothing that I've ever seen in Israel which even vaguely compares with what we have at the moment. I'm sure many of you have been following the events, but maybe what I'm saying now will give a certain amount of clarity. The red political parties, and next to each political party is the leader, are in this 8-party coalition that we have. We've had different kind of coalitions since the very first elections in 1949. Every single Israeli government has been a coalition government, but we have never, ever had a government that looks anything like this. So just very, very quickly to try and give a sense of what this government is all about. So I'll just start off with the Reds, the parties that are in the coalition partners. I say we're at 62 members or question mark, because several of these political parties have deviant members. So we say 62, some 1 or 2 members don't turn up or disagree or even vote for the opposition. So to run the Israeli Knesset with any sense of stability, one needs at least 61 in the House of 120 people to have any kind of sense of stability, and even 61 is very narrow. And so in this situation, it's a very, very vulnerable coalition government. Prime Minister Yamina, I say 7 or 6 because there were 7 members of the in the Knesset. One of them broke away from Yamina. The Yamina is one of the most right-wing parties. By the way, the radical right starts at the top, moving over to the radical left. So we have Yamina over there. We have the New Hope Party. Once again, we're on the right wing of the political spectrum. We have Yisrael Beitenu, who's a very unusual fellow over here. He's now Minister of Finance, very, very much in conflict with the Haredim. So that's become an increasingly important issue in the last few weeks. Here we have Likud, right of center, and we can see therefore that there are 3 political parties which are further right than Likud, which kind of, we can begin to understand the problems facing both those who to the right of Likud, and those to the left. As we're going to the left, we have the blue and white party, Benny Gantz over here, who did expect to become prime minister after Prime Minister Netanyahu, but that whole relationship soured in a very problematic way. Then we have Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid. Here is Yair Lapid, who's turned out to be a particularly interesting person in the last few months, and I'll come back to him in a moment. Labour Party headed by Merav Michaeli. That's the party where Rabbi Gilad Kariv is. We'll speak about him later. Meretz, the most left Jewish party with Nitzan Horowitz, sorry. And then the Ram party over here, which is actually an Islamic party. It's kind of right wing, but in the left wing in the Israeli consensus, with essentially 4 members, but one of them tends every now and again to deviate from the party line. So just to give, without wanting just to deal with the big overview issues, is the fascinating event of June the 18th, when the new government came into power. And Israeli politics is pretty rowdy, to put it mildly, but we've never seen anything exactly what we saw on July the 18th. And the opposition, now under the former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, was so out of control, there's no other terminology that we have, that it was actually impossible to hear any of the speeches. Yair Lapid did something very, very interesting. Rather than trying to give his prepared speech, he actually went there and made a very, very short comment by which he said that his mother, his parents, would have been absolutely embarrassed to know that their son was trying to make a speech in this situation. They would be embarrassed to realize exactly how the Knesset is behaving. What's interesting about the speech that he did not develop, it's been published in a vast number of places, is that probably people who would not normally have listened to him, the Knesset goes on and off and on a great deal, and not all that many people are actually listening to Knesset speeches. The fact that he did not deliver the speech, in a sense, made it a very important one in a strange kind of way. I'll just take the few sections that are in red here. Israel is hurting. It is time for peace in this land. And then he said, we need to find a way to forgive one another for the past. This particular government, although it doesn't always do what it says, what I'm going to say, it claims to do, has made an attempt to cut down the tensions between the government and the opposition, which is actually at an extremely unhealthy kind of situation. Because in Israel's situation, you need a broad cooperation between groups that don't necessarily agree with each other to make things stable. And the fact that we haven't had an accepted budget for 2 years because of the insecurity of the political system has been very, very unhealthy. We see that certain developments which should have been worked out easily by a national budget couldn't be done because it hasn't been passed. So this is what Yair Lapid speaks about, as does the new Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. We have an argument between us over politics and values, but we are not enemies. We live here together. Our fate is intertwined. And I would very much agree with that comment. The real divide is between moderates and extremists. Here he's very much talking partly about one of the Arab parties that he sees as extremists, but even more so than the religious Zionists, and I didn't go into those parties initially, who are extremely, very much on the radical right. Some of them are clearly Kahanists. We will not let the extremists destroy the state of Israel. We will not let hate control us. Violent racists, and this is very much speaking about the Jewish right, do not become patriots just because they wrap themselves in a flag. They will not define for us what it means to love Israel. I think this is a very important moment of Israeli society where a kind of a dream for the future is being forwarded. And it's not just about pragmatism, it's about some sort of wider belief, of faith, an understanding of what we should be doing. And I think while other ministers and other politicians are doing it, I think Yair Lapid is the leader in trying somehow or other to give us a voice and a hope for the future. Yair Lapid is a tremendous friend of the conservative and reform movements in Israel. He spoke about a keynote address at the recent World Union for Progressive Judaism convention. And he said, and I think it's true, I feel at home. I feel at home because Judaism is my home, pluralism is my home, and you are my family. Therefore, in terms of where we in the reform movement are, it's not only Yair Lapid, there's some other people, and I'll speak obviously about Gilad Kariv a little later, but it's really a very unusual situation for myself, someone committed to reform Judaism, to have friends in the Knesset at this kind of level. We must remind ourselves that he is the alternate prime minister. If everything works okay, 2 years' time, he will be prime minister, a very clear friend to the reform movement. By the way, in addition to the recent new president, Bushi Herzog, who's also a friend of the reform movement, as was in some senses the former President Rivlin. In addition to speaking internally, Yair Lapid made a very important statement to the European Union. In the past few years, our relationship with the European Union has been complex. The former Prime Minister Netanyahu decided very clearly how he would develop relationships with the world. And his policy was very clearly to go for the right-wing countries in the world. In the case of the European Union, we're speaking particularly about Poland and Hungary, to a lesser extent, the Czech Republic. He then went out to look at Argentina, India, and other places. Netanyahu put us into the basket, into the global basket of right-wing parties. This government is trying to do something very different. And therefore, the European Union, which has not felt comfortable with Israel for an extended period of time, except on certain levels, Poland and Hungary, although not always even those two countries. He had a meeting with them a short time ago, and he was very much mentioned that he wanted to restore a key annual bilateral forum, which used to exist and hadn't happened from the year 2012. So it's 9 years since we've actually been in this very important forum. Then he made a comment which I think was very important and politically valuable in the context of this coalition government which we have. And that is, Lapid stated that he backed a two-state solution with the Palestinians and noted Europe's and Israel's shared democratic values. However, he said something important, I think important for the Israeli population who might not fully agree with him politically, those who people on the right wing. He mentions the following: if there is eventually a Palestinian state, it must be a peace-loving democracy. We cannot be asked to take part in the building of another threat to our lives. Politicians, particularly in where we are at the moment in Israel, have to be very careful what they say. And we noticed a few days ago that the Prime Minister made some incorrect comments about Jewish presence on Temple Mount, and it could have blown up. It didn't blow up, by the way, I think because many Arab countries are waiting to see exactly what's going to happen. But I think Yair Lapid, as foreign minister, who is free from the domination of the prime minister, by the way, which has been the situation in a vast number of cases with foreign ministers who haven't been independent foreign ministers, but rather under the control of the prime minister. Here we are in a different situation because of the present coalition reality, and therefore he's become a very important voice to the wider world and a very different tone of where he would like Israel to go. The other new voices in the coalition, besides Yair Lapid, who's a good friend of ours, just to take three other people, but they're not the only ones. And I think it would be important, I could have gone on this list with another at least 6 or 7 members of the Knesset who are clearly friends of ours. At the top, without doubt, Rabbi Gilad Kariv, first Reform rabbi in the Knesset and head of a very important committee, the Constitution, Law and Justice Committee. A little bit of background of how the committees work in Israeli politics. The legal process is that as ministers or politicians want to present a new law, it has to go through the consensus of the committee as well. And Gilad Kariv is going to fight for this. He's going to want the government of Israel not to be in the hands of 1 or 2, 3 politicians, as very much been in the past, but to be under the control of the committee. Here came an interesting little anecdote, and that is the Haredi members of the Knesset from the United Torah Judaism, the Ashkenazim and the Shas party, who are Sephardim, refused to be on the committee. Normally you have members of the government and the coalition and the opposition in the various committees, somewhat to do with their political power. Here they've refused to be on that committee, but Gilad Kariv has gone full speed ahead and made it very, very clear, although that he's in the government, he would demand that the government ministers also go through the committee, because the committee really tends to be, in this particular case, people with legal background who can therefore ensure the framing of laws is done correctly. So he's been very active there. The other thing about Gilad Kariv, I follow his social media. I really don't know where he has the time, but he constantly writing comments in social media, always very, very well phrased, not antagonistic. He's not taking on the ultra-Orthodox parties, although they attack him day in and day out, but rather trying to move above it. Something about a dream of respectability of Israeli politics, which I've actually been waiting for some 54 years. The other person who's extremely important is Nachman Shai. Nachman Shai, we see over here. He's the Diaspora Affairs Minister, desperately trying to change what has happened until now, and you people are without doubt aware of it. The Netanyahu government essentially made diaspora affairs come under the control of the Israeli Orthodox contingent. This has been, for wherever I travel around the world over the years, working for the World Union for Progressive Judaism, I travel a great deal. And it always struck me wherever I went, the kind of feeling of people who were not Orthodox, the feeling of alienation towards Israel could be because of Israel's policies, but as much as anything else, we felt that the Israeli government was only on the side of the Orthodox in their particular countries. Nachman Shai has stated very clearly that he wants to change this, and he says openly he will reconnect all diaspora Jews to Israel, and there will be full equality for all denominations. We don't quite know whether this is exactly going to happen as we want, but that's what he will try and do. In addition to which, for the conservative movement, Alon Tal is extremely important, a major environmentalist and very active in the conservative movement. The little bit, just so we do deal with reality and what these are the leaders of the 8 parties in the coalition, just some of the comments to realize what this government is facing. And I think I know I've got my own political views, but I think the opposition has gone totally overboard. You know, they lost the election. They didn't do too badly, but they lost the election. And I have a kind of feeling that their frustration of being in the opposition, Netanyahu was in power for the last 12 years and 3 years, 2 decades before that. I think all of them have gone overboard. By the way, recently they seem to be a little bit quieter. Netanyahu did something which I would describe as childish. He encouraged the members of the opposition to continue calling him the prime minister and to not call Prime Minister Bennett the prime minister. It's stupid, it's childish. He said of Bennett, he doesn't have the international standing, he doesn't have the credibility, he doesn't have the ability, he doesn't have the knowledge. Well, I would say to Mr. Netanyahu, he's not doing too badly. Someone who hasn't been too central in Israeli politics. He was the Minister of Education, but he's actually shown pretty quickly that he's a good learner. He's learning how to do things. By the way, he's very capable. He is a highly successful high-tech person, and he made a great deal of money selling it out. So he's got a good sense of the wider world. The United Torah Judaism Ashkenazi Party said terrible things about the reformer, like I think dogs are Jews. It's a silly comment, and they basically are going to have to come to terms with that we're in, as Reformed Jews, we're in politics, national politics at long last. The Shas leader, Ari Deri, is totally convinced that this government is going to destroy the whole nature of religion. Well, what is already happening is that the chief rabbinate control over conversion and kashrut is going to go through change, not because of the reform movement, but because of the Minister of Religious Affairs, who's in Naftali Bennett's Yamina party. Moving towards the end is to speak just a little bit about religious affairs, which are obviously very important to us. And I picked it up just a bit on the earlier slide. In February this year, I'm sure many of you were following it, the High Court decided that non-Orthodox conversions in Israel would enable Israeli citizenship. This has been an issue which has been going essentially from the beginning of the State of Israel. Just if I can move just for a second back into a little bit of history, what really happened in terms of religion in Israel? The story starts back in the early period, the 1947, in fact, when the then about to be Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, looking around at what seemed to be an almost impossible task of creating the state, which would eventually happen in May 1948, he had a number of ideas which had a tremendous effect on the situation of religious affairs in the State of Israel. Firstly, he felt he couldn't deal with everything. And he looked around for a group of people who would be the representatives of religious affairs. And that was essentially the Orthodox group. With time, by the way, the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox, became increasingly important. But initially, Ben-Gurion handed over religion to the only group which really, in his mind, and he was correct at that time, could deal with religious issues. We have to remember, while the conservative movement moved in fairly early into Israeli concepts, the reform movement was slow. We weren't there at the beginning. Some people brought about some developments with our school in Haifa, with HUC and a few of the synagogues, but essentially we're very, very marginal. That enabled the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox to totally control the whole issue of Judaism in the State of Israel. We're being late in the game put us at a tremendous disadvantage. I think things are getting better. And at the moment, if this government can remain as it is, I think we're going to be in a good position. The High Court has been a good friend of ours, but the High Court only has a certain amount of power, and in many cases do not want to conflict with the Knesset. It's a very complex relationship that's existed from the very beginning. But as I said, the rules of the game were essentially set by David Ben-Gurion, not a religious man, although deeply understanding of Tanakh. And this has really been a very important moment. Appeals to the High Court through the Israeli Reform Movement, Iraq, and eventually this important decision, which was made in February this year, much to the annoyance, as we can imagine, by the ultra-Orthodox parties. Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, who I mentioned earlier, was when in the opposition, and then he's been consistent, and spoke about complete equality of rights for all streams of Judaism. Yair Lapid, by the way, is perceived by the ultra-Orthodox as an enemy. It isn't only Yair Lapid, but his late father, Tommy Lapid, was extremely angry, a Holocaust survivor, extremely angry with the tremendous amount of power which the religious parties had in Israeli politics. And Yair seemed to have picked up from his father many of the tremendous angst against the actions of the religious bodies. By the way, not only the religious political parties, but certainly the chief rabbinate as well. So he comes into it in some ways in a problematic situation. While he does speak about no one in the opposition is our enemies, some of the comments he's made, and I imagine he will continue to make, about the Haredim put him in an awkward position. He cannot be the intermediary, he cannot be the mediator in terms of what's going to happen in religious affairs. Therefore, this person becomes the most important. And in a way that I would never have imagined, if someone had said to me a little while ago, where is a member of the Yamina party, a right-wing modern Orthodox party, where will they be taking religious affairs? And the recent events, it's literally of the last week, are of major importance. Firstly, Matan Kahana is a colonel. Israeli society still respects army people, and as religious affairs minister, he's been discussing openly, and he's trying to develop a legal system, essentially which will deal with two very important components. One is the conversion process. Conversion process in Israel, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is totally in the hands of the chief rabbinate. The group, although we in the Reform movement and conservative movement feel the same, are very upset about it, the group which is actually, the largest group which has actually suffered the most are the Russian-speaking immigrants, who many of them were married to non-Jewish people and therefore have had to grapple with the Israeli bureaucracy in one way or the other. Matan Kahana, in a decision which is not only important for people like ourselves, but also extremely important for Russian speakers who want to feel and who are an integral part of Israeli society, to actually feel that they can be converted. They don't have to go through this very cumbersome stage of the chief rabbinate. And the other point, which is extremely important, which Kahana has introduced, is the whole question of kashrut. Kashrut, once again, has the kashrut authorities, which is a great moneymaker, by the way, we know that, has really managed to narrow their status within Israeli society. And there are a significant number of restaurants and cafes in Israeli society who are totally upset with them and are therefore turning to the Tzohar rabbis. Tzohar rabbis have been around for quite a time. There are approximately 1,000 of them, rabbis and educators, and they're taking over kashrut. And therefore, in a place where these rabbis have given the kashrut certificate, it doesn't say this is kashrut, because that would indicate that it's from the chief rabbinate. But this is the kashrut of the Tzohar movement. So it's very, very clear that it isn't a chief rabbinate situation. Articles have indicated that Orthodox people going to restaurants are quite happy to have the kashrut facilities of Tzohar rabbis and not necessarily only of the chief rabbinate. Very interesting situation in Israel about kashrut and conversion, which I think we should follow closely. And just one last comment, if we speak about the religious fairs, was a very nasty particular event during Tisha B'Av, where there were egalitarian services, mainly for the conservative movement, but Reform people were there as well. They just disrupted the egalitarian services, which are on the way to being established in the southern wall, near Robinson's Arch. Lapid immediately came in and spoke about baseless hatred, very much the terminology of sinat chinam that we say at during the period of Tisha B'Av, which brought about the conflict within the Jewish people. And the additional comment, and this I will end what I want to present here, the Rabbinical Council of America, which is an Orthodox organization, within 3 days, which we'd hoped to be in a bit earlier, regrets the uncivil disruption by Orthodox Jews, an important phenomenon. In one way or the other, in very different situations, we have to follow what Yair Lapid is going to do with religious affairs. Certainly the Minister of Religious Affairs, Gilad Kariv, who I think is doing a great job, and our friend from the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, who Shai, who will all be very, very important as we move into this stage. Thank you. I'll move over to you.
So thank you so much, Professor Liptz. I just wrote a message in the chat box there. So if anyone has any questions, we have about 10 minutes or so to 10, 12 minutes or so for a Q&A. We'll ask for you to just write your question into the chat at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to address as many questions as we can. Just take a minute as any questions roll in. So I do have a question. I can get us started, I suppose. One, I should just mention that we should all say thank you to Paul again, not only for his expertise, but also for making these slides available to us. I'm sure if you're like me, you'll want to reread some of the things that you saw today, some of these comments that were made. And I see that Professor Liptz has also included his Gmail account there. So I won't make any, maybe you'll want to address why, where, and how to use that email address appropriately. Very good. So,
sorry, over to you. Rabbi.
Please, I was just going to ask a question. Go ahead, please.
I just wanted to mention the Gmail. I always give my Gmail. I've been, as we mentioned at the beginning, I've been involved in a tremendous amount of Zoom lectures in the last year or so. And I always welcome questions. So if after the session, there's anything that you would like to ask me, if you want any particular sources, I'm always feel I'm totally available even after the end of this exact presentation. So please do make a note of my email, and write to me, and I always try and reply as quickly as possible.
Thank you. So our first question comes from Lee Weiser, the president of Arts of Canada. She asks, what are the issues that the opposition might focus on in order to bring down the government?
The opposition basically has to try and convince 3 or 4 people from the government to deviate, to move over to their side. So it actually isn't an issue, but just let me give you a case study of how they've tried to work. Gantz, who had hoped to become prime minister, and Netanyahu played his cards very, very poorly. They have been approaching Gantz, apparently, so we are told, and offered him the premiership immediately. Now, Gantz had been waiting as the number 2 for an extended period of time and wasn't given the position. Netanyahu, who's the most astute politician that one can imagine, knew how to actually get him out of the position. So this is what you can do. You can go to any of the people in the government and offer them. I mean, the offer that Gantz was given to say, well, overnight you can become prime minister, which you really wanted to be. Gantz is hopefully not going to take advantage of that very fine offer, but that's exactly what's going to happen. So the delicate nature of the coalition opposition means that the opposition at this time is going to bribe any of the people in the government to move over to their side. You know, right through Israeli politics, that's happened. It's not a new event. Just to go back to one of the famous case studies, Moshe Dayan, a central member of the Labour Party, deviated and went over to support Menachem Begin when Menachem Begin became prime minister on the basis that he would actually play a role in the peace treaty with Egypt. And that was correct. Not only because of Dayan, but also because of Begin himself and some other central politicians. The fact that Dayan left his own party and went in with Menachem Begin, and with his tremendous knowledge and status within the Arab world, really did assist in the peace treaty which was signed with Egypt in 1979. So this is really the way that Israeli politics works. So this is essentially what the government is trying, the opposition is trying to do with the government at the moment.
Fantastic. There's another question here. Let's see, I'll just read it exactly as it's phrased. You seem to be optimistic about the direction of religious affairs momentum in Israel, yet birth rates indicate ultra-Orthodox will have a far greater voting influence in the future. Concerns?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, I think there's absolutely everyone who isn't ultra-Orthodox has concerns on this level. The predictions are that in about, we are now 30 years time, 40 years time, the Haredim will be 1/3 of Israeli society. However, here comes the big question. In history, we often speak about the red line of politics. And the question is that are the Haredim, who have an average of 7 children per family, going to sometime or other look around and say, well, we're losing out? Now, with this government not handing as much money over to the Haredim, they are going to find themselves in a difficult position. And we have a case study. Many years ago, when Netanyahu was finance minister, he reduced the benefits that were given to the Haredim. And we found 2 results during that particular period. One was that they went to look out for work. They had to look for work. They weren't being provided with national funds. And the other was that the number of children that they had was slightly reduced. So the answer is we don't quite know what could happen if the Haredim are in a deep economic crisis. By the way, at the moment, many of them survive on overseas assistance from a wealthy Jewish philanthropist. But if they struggle financially and they get into the workplace, and that's in addition to the fact that they don't have the money, if you work, there's a good chance that you're going to cut down the number of children. So although this is the optimistic projection, the other projection, which the demographers say, is what I mentioned earlier, that in about 30 or 40 years' time, they will be 30% of the country. It is of major concern, so much so that there is an interesting thesis in Israel that all of us should go and meet the Haredim at their level, that we shouldn't see them as the opposition or the enemy, but rather we should actually try and work together with them to convince them that we're not as bad as they think we are. So however we look at it, the jury is out on this issue, but it is a fact of deep concern.
Thank you. So I think we've got time for two more questions. I'll give you a bit of a layup, and then we'll end with a kind of a hard-hitting question. And so my question is about this speech that never happened. And I'm wondering, maybe I missed it, and so maybe I wasn't listening carefully enough. What was the reasoning? Some of these quotes were so strong. What was the reasoning for this speech not to be delivered?
Because that was such chaos in the Knesset that none of the government members could actually make a speech. That means the rowdy nature, they were shouting. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. You know, there's a whole situation, you can be called to order 3 times by the Speaker of the Knesset. If the Speaker had called to order everyone who was shouting and acting in a terrible way, there would have been half the Knesset wouldn't have been there. So it was actually an impossible reality. It was disgusting. There's no other word for it. That the noise level was so high that the speakers couldn't be heard. And so therefore, Lapid, rather than trying to be heard, he would have had a shout or something like that all the time. He just decided to do it in this other way. And his little introduction about his parents would have been so embarrassed, I think hit home. Afterwards, as I said, vast numbers of people were interested in actually reading the speech.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I did catch that. I just missed it. So we'll conclude with a tough one. A question has been posed. If Bennett's government, what is the Bennett government planning to do to facilitate the creation of a Palestinian state? What are their plans in the next 2 to 3 years?
Nothing's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years. The Bennett government, if we go back to what I mentioned earlier, has these 3 or 4 parties who are on the right wing who don't believe it. So we have a government that, although in the minds of many citizens in the country, is a whole lot better than the previous government, and I think it will be a benefit to the wider society, we can't ignore a very important fact of Israeli society. And that is, Israeli society is a right-wing society. It's a right-wing country. For many reasons, religious groups are right-wing. Many Russian speakers are right-wing. In fact, I would say, if I look at the immigrant groups coming into Israel in the last 20 or 30 years, the amount of immigrants who belong to the political right and not to the political center or left grows all the time. So that means you have a reality in this country. Palestinian state is an idea which probably at this moment, only 30 or maybe 40% at the best of Israeli voters agree to it. And even then, you know, are frightened, because is a Palestinian state going to be a Hamas kind of state? The present Palestinian Fatah government is very weak in the territories. And therefore, it could well be that Hamas will be on our borders. That means Israeli citizens, and this is regardless of political views, are very concerned of what a Palestinian state would mean. And so therefore, I think, and by the way, I would just like to quote Gilad Kariv. He was in the town that we live in, Even Yehuda. He came to give a speech to the Labour Party members, and there was about 50 or 60 people in the audience, an excellent audience, by the way. And his presentation basically said the following: don't expect too much. The nature of a government which has such powerful right-wing forces is not going to enable the left-wing forces to make decisions. We live in a complex kind of democracy with tremendous faults. Therefore, the will of the majority prevails. And as I say, at the moment, it's very hard to persuade the majority of Israelis, once again, ignoring political views, that a Palestinian state on our borders is going to be okay for Israel. The fear of what that might be is tremendous. And by the way, you know, when we sit with friends of ourselves, we're left of center, sit with many of our friends of the left of center framework of Israeli society, I think almost all of them, we end our sentences saying we would love to get to a situation of a Palestinian state, not in the borders that they would necessarily like, but we would like to see that happening. And we always end our sentences with a but we know that whatever decision we make in Israel, we have to make that decision based on our national security. And I think that is really an important Israeli reality, which I have a feeling that when you live out of Israel, one doesn't necessarily look at the situation in the same way.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm going to invite Les Rothschild onto this screen now as well to offer our final words of gratitude. But let me say it myself as well, that we really appreciate your time and expertise.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Les, over to you for the closing words.
Thank you, Rabbi. And Paul, it was a pleasure to have you here again. Your insight is really a treasure for us. You always have some really good points to make and allow us to think a little deeper about some of the things that are happening that we don't necessarily see or read in the press. So we will hopefully continue to have you come and enlighten us on these things, because really it is really worthwhile.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you all for coming, our Holy Blossom members, and I also see some friends from Solel, so I want to do a shout out to them, and also to Arts of Canada. There are a few people from Arts of Canada as well. So to all of you, thank you very much for coming. We have in 2 weeks the next part of our series, and that is with the National Library of Israel, and it's the modern Israeli calendar. The National Library of Israel, we've had them once before, and it's a really interesting, and they provide really in-depth presentation. And they are going to be doing the modern Israel calendar, an exploration of contemporary Israel society through key events in the national calendar. And so they're going to look at the resources that they have and give us a different insight into contemporary Israel. So I hope you will join us then. We will be sending out, as Rabbi said, the slides and a recording to you after this. And I just want to end by thanking Rabbi Goodman for the work that he did. He's not only our rabbinical advisor, but he's also our technical advisor. So thank you for doing all the behind the scenes technical stuff. So to all of you, thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks all.
Thank you so much.